In our previous lecture, we found formal charges of atoms in small molecules. Doing each calculation is fine for small molecules taught in a general chemistry course. But in organic chemistry, molecules are larger, and we want to be able to identify formal charges quickly. To do this, we should learn the trends in formal charges. Fortunately for us, we'll focus on only 3 elements: carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. These are the most common elements seen in organic chemistry. First, let's review the formula for finding formal charge. The formal charge for an atom is the number of valence electrons in the neutral atom, then we'll subtract the number of non-bonding electrons, then we'll subtract 1 electron from each bonding pair. Let's start with carbon. Carbon typically will have 4 bonds. These could include single bonds or may include double or triple bonds. In all of these cases, we can start with carbon's 4 valence electrons, then subtract 0 for non-bonding electrons. Then we'll subtract 4 for each electron from each of the 4 bonding pairs. For any carbon with 4 bonds, the formal charge will be 0. Carbon can also exist as an ion. On the left, the carbon carries a pair of non-bonding electrons, and 3 electrons in 3 bonding pairs. Its formal charge is -1, and it is called a carbanion. On the right, carbon has less than the octet rule. It has 0 non-bonding electrons and 3 electrons in the 3 bonding pairs. Its formal charge is +1, and this is called a carbocation. Let's recap. Carbon with 3 bonds in a lone pair has a formal charge of -1 and is called a carbanion. Carbon with 4 bonds and no lone pairs has a formal charge of 0, while carbon with 3 bonds and no lone pairs has a formal charge of +1, and it is called a carbocation. You can use the same formulas to confirm the formal charges for nitrogen. Here are the most common that we'll see in organic chemistry. Nitrogen with 2 bonds and 2 lone pairs carries a formal charge of -1. Nitrogen with 3 bonds and 1 lone pair carries a formal charge of 0. And nitrogen with 4 bonds and no lone pairs carries a formal charge of +1. And here are the formal charges for oxygen. Oxygen with 1 bond and 3 lone pairs carries a -1 formal charge. Oxygen with 2 bonds and 2 lone pairs carries a 0 formal charge. And oxygen with 3 bonds and 1 lone pair carries a +1 formal charge. Now let's close with one example. Use your notes of the trends we discussed. I'll give you a few seconds to pause this video so you can find the formal charges for all the non-hydrogen atoms. I'll start with the carbons. First, I'll note that these carbons all have 4 bonds. Thus, they carry a formal charge of 0. But this carbon looks different. It has 3 bonds and no lone pairs. It has a formal charge of +1. This oxygen has 2 bonds and 2 lone pairs, thus carries a formal charge of 0, as does the last oxygen. The last oxygen has 2 bonds as a double bond, but its formal charge is still 0. Finally, let's look at the nitrogen. This nitrogen has 4 bonds and no lone pairs. It has a formal charge of +1.